2024 was a bad year for major U.S. retailers, with more than 7,300 stores closing. That's according to Coresight Research.
You like to go in and touch and feel and look and colors, see if it matches things when you're making stuff. You can't do that online.
By early July 2025, the crisis had taken a quantifiable toll. 4.7 million American households could no longer afford to purchase essential groceries each week. This was no longer a projection or warning. It was the stark reality for millions of families across the country. At the same time, more than 13% of small retail stores had been forced to shut down in just 3 months, unable to sustain operations amidst vanishing inventories and escalating wholesale costs. The collapse was fast, widespread, and disproportionately devastating for low-income communities. In many rural states like Mississippi and West Virginia, basic access to food had become a logistical nightmare. Residents were driving 30 to 40 kilometers, sometimes even farther, just to reach the nearest store that still had milk bread or canned vegetables on the shelves. The scenes were eerily reminiscent of the early pandemic panic in 2020. But this time there was no virus, no natural disaster, no supply chain freeze caused by lockdowns. This time the disruption was man-made, rooted in economic policy. The trigger, a sweeping set of tariff increases implemented in late May 2025, aimed at reshaping U.S. trade relationships. Instead, it upended the country's retail infrastructure, sending shockwaves from import docks all the way to household dinner tables. Few had expected a trade policy to manifest so quickly, so painfully, in the form of empty shelves and rising hunger. Yet here we were, not in a third world country, but in the United States, watching the food system crack from the top down. By July 2025, the effects of the tariff-induced disruption were no longer just economic abstractions. They were physically visible in supermarkets across the United States. From major urban centers to rural towns, large retailers like Walmart, Target, and Home Depot began displaying the unmistakable signs of a supply chain under pressure. Shelves growing increasingly sparse, aisles missing common goods, and signs hastily taped to empty racks reading "out of stock. Please check back later." Customers once used to overflowing inventory and 24/7 availability now wandered store aisles pushing nearly empty carts. Essential goods like canned vegetables, rice, pasta, and even basic hygiene items were suddenly hard to come by. Many Americans began modifying shopping routines, visiting multiple stores, or reducing their purchases altogether. Some items were limited per customer, further signaling that the shortages were no longer isolated incidents, they were systemic. One woman in Iowa interviewed outside a Walmart put it plainly, "I never thought we'd see shelves this empty again. Not after COVID. That was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime thing." What made the situation even more striking was the absence of panic buying. Unlike during the early months of the pandemic, there were no hoarding sprees, no viral social media videos of consumers fighting over paper towels. Instead, the scarcity was slower and more structural, an unfolding vacuum created not by consumer behavior, but by tariffs choking off the flow of imported goods from Asia, Mexico, and Europe. It was in many ways a quieter crisis, but no less disruptive. Analysts began noting that the issue wasn't only the cost of goods rising, but the breakdown in availability. Grocers and retail managers reported delays in restocking, cancellations of shipments, and shrinking lists of suppliers willing to ship to the U.S. under the current tariff regime. The result? A creeping uneven shortage that affected different regions and product categories in unpredictable ways. For many Americans, the grocery store, once a symbol of abundance and reliability, had become a weekly reminder of a system that was beginning to unravel. By mid-2025, American consumers were no longer just seeing empty shelves, they were feeling the weight of higher prices in their wallets. A basic grocery run, once routine and affordable, had become a financial burden for many families. A typical basket containing just a few staples such as rice, pasta, frozen vegetables, milk, and fruit could now cost as much as $275 depending on the region and availability. For many households, that kind of spending was simply unsustainable on a regular basis. According to a report from Yale's Budget Lab, the impact of newly imposed tariffs had added an estimated $2,600 to $5,000 in annual grocery costs for the average U.S. household. This spike was not driven by demand shocks or natural disasters. It was directly traced to increased import duties on essential goods, particularly those from China, Mexico, and the European Union. These included everything from packaged foods and canned goods to fresh produce and dairy products. While inflation has been a familiar economic concern over the past decade, this was something different. It wasn't cyclical or speculative, it was policy-driven and structural, affecting items that families buy every single week. and it was disproportionately harmful to those already living paycheck to paycheck. For low-income households, the rising costs didn't just tighten budgets, they threatened food security itself. These families typically spend a larger share of their income on groceries and have fewer options for cost-cutting. Generic brands bulk buying or shifting to cheaper substitutes were already standard practice. With prices rising even on those basic options, many were left with nowhere else to economize. The ripple effects extended beyond the grocery store. Local food banks reported a sharp increase in demand, and consumer credit card debt began to climb again, driven in part by families using credit to cover basic needs. In certain states, school meal programs saw increased participation during summer breaks, a clear signal that food insecurity was deepening even outside of traditional poverty zones. This wasn't just inflation. It was, as many economists and community advocates warned, a survival crisis in slow motion, one that hit the most vulnerable first and hardest. And as long as the tariff policies remained unchanged, there was no sign of relief on the horizon. In the suburban outskirts of Pennsylvania, a small family-owned grocery store open for over 17 years recently turned off its lights for good. The owner, who had weathered recessions, the COVID-19 pandemic, and fluctuating consumer trends, finally reached a breaking point. His shelves had gone too long without being restocked. The shipments just stopped coming, he explained. Our suppliers are now prioritizing Walmart. We've been pushed to the back of the line and we couldn't keep going. His story isn't unique. Across the country, thousands of independent grocers and small retailers are facing the same fate. In a retail environment dominated by giants with massive supply chain leverage, these smaller businesses are struggling to compete not just on price, but on basic access to inventory. With tariffs raising the cost and complexity of importing goods, wholesalers are increasingly focusing their limited stock on bulk buying behemoths like Walmart, Kroger, and Costco, leaving independents at a disadvantage they can't overcome. This dynamic is especially devastating in rural areas, immigrant neighborhoods, and so-called food deserts regions where small stores are often the only local source of groceries. In many of these communities, a shuttered grocer means not just inconvenience, but a full-blown access crisis. Without a vehicle or reliable public transportation, many residents find themselves cut off from fresh produce, protein, and everyday essentials. The National Grocers Association, NGA, which represents thousands of independent and family-run grocery businesses, has issued multiple warnings to federal agencies. Their message is urgent and consistent. The current trade policies are creating structural imbalances that favor large corporate chains and endanger the survival of smaller community-based businesses. This growing divide is not just economic, it's geographic and social. The burden of this uneven access falls hardest on working-class and marginalized populations, and it risks entrenching long-term disparities in food access and nutrition outcomes. What makes the situation particularly alarming is that it mirrors the early phases of the 2020 pandemic, but without any of the emergency funding or broad public awareness that came with COVID-19. This time, the collapse is quieter, slower, and more permanent. Once a small grocer closes its doors, it rarely reopens. And in many communities, no replacement is coming. Policymakers defended the tariffs as a necessary long-term corrective measure. But economists, consumer advocates, and even corporate leaders warned that the short-term fallout was already too severe. The White House, facing growing backlash, hinted at potential adjustments, but no timeline or relief had been confirmed by early July. What began as a calculated political maneuver to reshape global trade ended up triggering one of the most acute domestic retail disruptions in recent history. And unlike previous crises driven by external shocks, this one was entirely self-inflicted, born not of a virus, a war, or a natural disaster, but of policy choices made at the very top. And so we return to where we began, not in a White House press room or on the floor of Congress, but in the fluorescent aisles of a supermarket in Middle America. The empty shelves, the silent checkout lanes, the frustrated shoppers pushing carts filled with less than they can afford. These are not the images of an economic superpower thriving. They are the images of policy made distant from the realities it governs. What started on May 27, 2025 as a strategic gesture to rebalance global trade quickly became something far more consequential, a test of resilience not for governments or corporations, but for the millions of people who rely on the basic functionality of the retail system just to feed their families. The 2025 tariff war didn't just adjust economic indicators, it reshaped daily life. It dictated what people could buy, where they could buy it, and how much they had to pay. It widened the gap between corporate retail giants and the independent grocers that anchor communities. It punished those with the least room to maneuver while offering no clear roadmap forward. If there is a lesson to be taken from the crisis, it is this. In a deeply interconnected world, domestic policies do not stop at national borders, and their consequences do not stop at the spreadsheet. They spill into homes, into wallets, and onto the shelves of every store in the country. This time, the shelves went empty not because of fear, but because of choice.